and welcome everyone from the National Commission for Indian System of Medicine. Board of Unani, Siddha and Soa Rigpa welcomes you to get acquainted in this video on teaching and learning in competency-based dynamic curriculum, which is designed for postgraduate studies in Siddha and Unani medicine. We shall look into the detailed review of lecture hour, practical training hour and experiential learning hour in this particular video. Let's first look into a lecture hour. Lecture, although a large group teaching method, it can be effectively modified while implementing for all small group for postgraduate teaching. This can be structured in the following ways based on the content of teaching. There can be a formal lecture, there can be a discussion-based lecture, there can be audio-visually enhanced lecture, demonstration-based lecture, and interactive lecture. Describe research process and importance of evidence-based medicine. This can be taught as a lecture hour. In the medical statistics, similar example is the student should be able to explain the data, variables and their types. This can be better taught as a lecture hour. There are 5 lecture hours in a credit. Let's look into the practical training hour. Practical hours are meant to bridge gap between theoretical knowledge and the real world application. These hours refer to the hands-on learning through laboratories, clinical settings or clinical classrooms, simulation labs, community-based training, diacritical reading, calculations, interpretations, problem solving, etc. Practical training elicits a guided response. Hence, it should be always done in the presence of a facilitator. The practical hour should be aimed at providing the skill development in a student. He should be able to do a real-world application. He should be able to emphasize critical thinking, problem solving, decision making. There should be confidence building in practical hour, and there should be interpersonal skill development in a practical hour. If we look into a credit, there are 10 practical training hours in a credit. Let's take an example that can be used for practical training. In a research methodology, a student should be able to demonstrate literature research in a medical database. So this can be done practically. Similar example in medical statistics is where the student should be able to construct the tables with one or more factors of classification manually or using a statistical tool or a software. So this topic can be taught in a practical training hour. Let's look into detail about what experiential learning hour is. The experiential learning hour has been first time introduced into the curriculum. So it is important for all of us to get acquainted in detail about what experiential learning basically means to us. Experiential learning is an immersive and hands-on educational approach where the learners gain knowledge, skill and values from direct experience outside the traditional academic setting. This has been stated by David Kolb, one of the educationalists who has been celebrated through years. Experiential learning happens in real-life scenario with the intention of adaptation, reflection and origination. And if you look into a credit, there are 13 experiential learning hours in a credit and the 2 hours of modular assessment together contributing for 15 hours for experiential learning. When experiential learning is effectively implemented, we can find there are many positive benefits to the student. It has a 90% retention memory. It makes the learning flexible, gains more confidence. It incorporates all possible ways of learning into a full cycle of learning, brings about effective skills and meta-learning abilities. Experiential learning entails giving learner more authority and responsibility in learning. It involves them directly in their learning process within the learning atmosphere. Experiential learning involves the following process. The step 1, which is called as a concrete experience. Here, the students take part in the tangible experiential, which talks about the do component for a student. The second step is reflective observation. Here, the student is able to replicate what he experienced, and then he also talks about the other evidences, which talks about the reflect component of learning. In the third step, that is abstract conceptualization, which basically talks about cultivating the theories in line with the experience and the information, which talks about the think component of learning. And the last step, the fourth one, is the active experimentation. Here, the student articulates an assumption or elucidative problem which talks about the actual application of what he has learned. So if you look into the experiential learning, any opportunity that gives us an option for feedback and reflection makes it an absolute good content for an experiential learning. So if we look into the cycle of experiential learning, it has got the concrete experience, the do component, the reflect component, the think component, and the apply component. Let's look into each components in detail. The concrete experience, let's try to understand this with an example of performing a PHU procedure, a medicated enema in Siddha, or a hijama procedure, which talks about the cupping therapy in Unani. This is a stage where the student actually performs a PHU or a hijama. And what happens here is the student is engaging in the hands-on aspect of this particular task. During this experience of performing a PHU or a hijama, the student actively applies the theoretical, the practical knowledge they have learnt about the procedure, also applies the hygiene practices, the patient communication skills, and the positioning skills while doing these procedure. The concrete experience allows them to understand the sensory, the physical, and the practical aspect of the procedure. So the step 1 involves the concrete experience, which actually is talking about performing a procedure. The second step of experiential learning is called as reflective observation. Continuing with the similar example of PHU and hijama, the student after performing the PHU or hijama takes time to reflect on what he experienced just now. This involves thinking about what went well, what challenges he or she encountered, how the patient responded, and any other unexpected factors they found while performing the procedure. Reflective observation helps the student process their initial experience, noting areas where they felt confident, as well as the areas where they felt uncertain or needed more practice. So in this stage, the student is actually reflecting all that he experienced while performing the procedure. There is a specific way how the reflection process should basically happen. The student goes into various steps of reflection. For example, what did he do? What was important about what he did? Where he could use this again? Whatever the experience that he did, did he see any pattern in what he did? And then how well he did it? And then finally, what he could do next. So these are called as the taxonomy of reflection, which basically talks about remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. This should happen in a reflective observation. Let's look into the step 3 of experiential learning. It is called as abstract conceptualization. Let's understand this again with the example of PHU and hijama. Here, student gets back to the resources for learning and thinks about the ideal ways of performing a PHU or a hijama. In this stage, the student analyzes the experience and integrates new knowledge with theoretical understanding. We all understand that the student has learnt this particular procedure either by visualizing or has read it from the concept of textual understanding. So here he goes back and checks whether he is aligning with whatever he has learnt in what he performed. The students might review guidelines, consult with a mentor or a supervisor, or they can also refer the educational material to fill any gaps they encounter during their first attempt. So abstract conceptualization helps the students form insight and develop strategies to improve, reinforcing best practices and learning from any errors. So at this point, the student actually cross-checks what he has done is in the right principle or not. The step 4, which involves active experimentation. At this phase, the student applies and reflects what he learnt in subsequent experiences of performing PHU and hijama. Here the student applies the insights he or she gained to future opportunities. In their next clinical experience, they experiment with adjustments based on their reflection and learning, aiming to perform the PHU or hijama more effectively or confidently. Active experimentation helps the student refine their skills and build a deeper understanding of the procedure through repeated application. Let's look into some examples that are there in our research methodology and biostatistics curriculum. In the research methodology, a learning outcome which states that identify a research problem. Here, the student can learn by the experiential learning. Similarly, identify and interpret the point, estimate, and confidence in the biostatistics can also be learned through experiential learning. One of the doubts that we might have in our mind is there any difference between practical and experiential R? Let's look into few parameters, and then also we shall look into what exactly this parameter have to do with the practical and experiential R. For example, if you look into the presence of a facilitator, in a practical hour, he is always present because it's a guided response. Whereas in experiential R, he may or may not be present, and when he is present, the role is limited. And what is the role of a facilitator? In a practical R, he is responsible for the entire teaching session and evaluation. Whereas in an experiential R, he is only an instructor, guide, or an evaluator. If you look into the hours, a practical has got 10 hours, whereas an experiential learning has 13 hours. And if you look at the degree of independence to a student, in a practical hour, student learns, perform, and practices under the guidance of a teacher. Whereas in experiential learning hour, student is more autonomous. He is more self-directed. If you look into levels in Miller's pyramid, a practical hour shows how is the level, which is level 3. Whereas in experiential R, it is the level 4, where the student is at the level of doing something. So it is at a does level. Experiential learning is a flexible learning approach, and that is why it is so much important to be incorporated in a PG curriculum. Experiential learning has its importance as it is an ongoing method of learning. It need not to be limited or restricted to the time boundaries of a running module. The scope of experiential learning is expanded to the opportunity of learning as and when he or she is exposed to the learning topic. The experiences have to be documented by the scholar in his or her logbook or a portfolio. The facilitator should create opportunities to experientially learn at least to the minimum prescribed hour throughout the program. The hours can be exhibited during their in-house or out-house postings as per the curriculum. So in this video, we have learnt about the 3 methods of teaching learning that is used in the Cbdc. In the next video, we shall learn about the methods of assessment. Thank you.